Like 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, hold on. What? So give me just a minute and then I'll say whenever you're ready. I'm just gonna get my timer set up. You can start whenever you are ready.
Hi, my name is Anna, and today I'm going to be talking about parental support and its influence on high school students' parasocial relationships. So starting off with an introduction, new forms of technology are more and more at the fingertips of today's youth. 95% of American teenagers report having access to a smartphone, and 45% report feeling constantly connected online. Celebrities and media personalities are more and more able to interact directly or indirectly with individuals through online platforms and social media. And it's been proven that more media exposure correlates to a high rate of parasocial relationship formation. So the categories I'm going to cover in my literature review are parasocial processes, parental support, and the social needs of adolescents. Parasocial interaction is defined by the seminal paper Horton and Wool from 1956 as a conversational give and take between a media user and a media performer. For parasocial interaction to exist, there must be a sense of the individual being directly addressed by the media performer. This can otherwise be referred to as breaking the fourth wall. For PSI to exist, the individual may be aware that the relationship is one-sided, but nonetheless perceives it as an intimate connection. PSI is a similar term, but definitely separate from parasocial relationships, or PSRs, which are defined as long-term attachments to media performer that persist beyond the media exposure. And PSRs may form in conjunction with PSIs, so in other words, you don't need that sense of being directly addressed in order for PSRs to form. A study done on college-age students showed how different types of loneliness correlated to PSR formation. And it was found that familial loneliness was positively related to PSR formation in women, but negatively related in men. So gender is a mediating factor. There is comparatively little research in PSR formation in adolescents compared to adults. A study by Giles and Melby found that attachment to celebrities increases during adolescence. So as attachment to parents decreases, attachment to celebrities increases, and this might suggest that children could look to celebrities to fulfill the roles that parents once carried out. So all this goes to show that PSRs are diverse and affected by real-life interpersonal relationships. A study, or a seminal source by Bowlby in 1973 showed that parents serve as a guide on social skills to their children. So they show their children how to organize themselves and present themselves to others and organize their relationships. This idea was further developed in Bowlby's 1982 paper on attachment theory, which found that parental attachment may predict social relationships. Furthermore, in the age range of 15 to 18-year-olds, there is a positive relationship between parental attachment and the performance and confidence of social skills. So this means that the high school age is especially important as it relates to parental impact, because parental impact is more pronounced during this age range. So positive social interaction with peers and adults has been shown to be a primary need of adolescents. Without this positive interaction, mental health suffers and rates of depression actually increase along with other negative mental health symptoms. As discussed, parental support heavily impacts the development of an adolescent's social skills, and if an adolescent lacks social skills, it makes it harder to maintain peer relationships. So this brings me to my gap in the presented research. So my first gap is that many effects of parental support on adolescents has been studied, but not as parental support relates to PSR specifically. My second gap is that PSRs haven't been explored as a possible alternative to peer-to-peer relationships. So if the social needs of an adolescent aren't met by parents or friends, could they perhaps turn to PSRs to fulfill these needs? Additionally, parasocial relationships are not well studied in adolescents compared to adults, and the years of high school especially have been determined to be important as they relate to the parental impact on children. Also, finally, the Midwestern region has not been the focus of any relevant research in the field of PSRs or parental support so far. So that brings me to my research question, which is, does lacking parental support result in increased parasocial relationship strength in high school students? So my hypothesis is that a low level of parental support will result in a higher strength of parasocial relationships. So I'm expecting to find a negative correlation between those two variables. So in order to conduct my research, I decided to go with a correlational survey because I'm trying to find the relationship between two variables, and an experimental method wasn't really possible here because not only would manipulating parental support be possibly unethical, but also beyond the scope of this research. So I went with an online format for my survey, which allowed for easy distribution and data collection, and I distributed it by emailing it out to teachers in a Midwestern suburban high school and asking them to administer it to their students. Participation was entirely anonymous and completely optional as well. So for the structure of my survey, it began with a section asking basic demographic information such as the age of the participant, the race, and their living situation with their parents. And then the second part of the survey asked about PSRs, and I utilized the Parasocial Interaction scale. I based my questions off of this scale because it was previously established in relevant research in the field. Many studies have used this scale and found it to be credible. And finally, my last section was asking about parental support. And in order to find a wide range of different data and cover all the various aspects of parental support, I asked questions regarding 3 different categories, which were emotional, educational, and social support. So my research focused on collecting mostly quantitative data, and I used a 1 to 5 point Likert scale, with 1 being strongly disagree with the statement and 5 being strongly agree. And this made up the bulk of my survey. And I used the Likert scale specifically because it allowed for easy analysis of data, and it was easy for participants to interpret what they were looking at and what answer most applied to them. And then I also asked a few multiple choice questions, which were only in the demographics section of the survey. So I collected a small amount of qualitative data, which was only in the PSR section. It was only 1 question, and it was asking the participant to briefly describe their parasocial relationship. So there were a few ethical concerns in this survey, mostly that I wanted to avoid possible admissions of abuse from the participant. So I carefully worded my questions and also included a link to a domestic abuse hotline. So that brings me to my results. In the demographics section, there was a slight majority of female participants at 51.3%, and a slight lack of male participants at only 40.1%. The age ranges were pretty representative, from 14-year-olds to 18-year-olds. I didn't receive any 13 or 19-year-olds. And there was a slightly larger percentage of 15-year-olds at 33.2%. And the question asking who do you live with most of the time received a majority of responses said that they live with both their biological mother and father at 62.6%. But as you can see, there was a wide range of different answers to this question. So conclusions based off of this data weren't really able to be found because there were so many different answers. So the results of the parasocial relationship section. Again, these questions used a 1 to 5 Likert scale, which allowed for averages of individual responses to be easily found. And this section began with a brief definition of what a PSR was, so that participants were informed going into the study, and then asked participants if they had a parasocial relationship. And participants who said yes, they did have PSRs, were sorted into Group A, and there were 31 respondents in this group. And participants who said they did not have a PSR were sorted into Group B, and there were 156 respondents in this group. So there's quite a large disparity between these two groups. And for Group A, I found, again using that Likert scale, I found the averages of the questions, and found a mean of 3.62, which shows a trend towards moderately strong parasocial relationships overall. And for Group B, they did not take the rest of the PSR section, so I don't have a mean for Group B here. So for the parental support data, again use that 1 to 5 Likert scale, and for Group A, I found a mean of 3.00, which indicates no trend towards strong or weak parental support. And for Group B, I found a mean of 3.17, which indicates a slight trend towards moderately strong parental support. So the analysis and conclusion I can draw off of this data is I calculated a correlation coefficient using Group A's data. And I found, I calculated this by comparing the means of the PSR section to the means of the parental support section. And I found a correlation coefficient of negative 0.000466, which is extremely close to 0 and indicates that there's no correlation between these two variables. So my hypothesis, which was that I would find a negative correlation, was proven incorrect. However, I can still draw some inferences based off of this data, mainly that the quality of parental support may influence whether or not PSRs are present, so it may influence the frequency and not the intensity of them. And I can draw this conclusion because the means of parental support for Group A and Group B, Group B's measure was slightly higher than Group A's, and again, Group B did not have PSRs. So in conclusion, strong parental support may discourage PSR formation, but there are no effects seen from its absence. So there were a few limitations in this study. Primarily it was that there was a huge disparity between the size of Group A and Group B. So Group A only had 31 respondents, Group B had 156. So this could impact the representativeness of Group A's data. So my conclusions that I draw from this might not be as widely applicable as if Group B, or as if Group A was a larger size. My second limitation is that parasocial relationships aren't a topic that's commonly known of in this age range or in the Midwestern region. So participants' lack of previous knowledge about PSRs could have been a problem. It might even explain the size difference between Group A and Group B, because participants might have answered they did have a PSR when they really didn't, or vice versa, or even answered questions in the PSR section inaccurately because they didn't really know what the question was asking. My third limitation is that the question I asked in the demographics section, asking who do you live with most of the time, received a huge variety of different responses because I failed to account for the many different types of family models that exist. So any correlation or inferences on this question couldn't really be found because of the wide variety of different responses. And then finally, my adaptation of the PSI scale in the PSR section could have been faulty because the Parasocial Interaction scale was originally meant to be used in conjunction with an experimental method, and since my method was a survey, there could have been some mistakes made in adaptation that lowered the validity of the data collected. So some implications for further research are, I believe my research helps the field understand the role and impact that parents play in raising their children. Additionally, future research could differentiate between parental support and parental guidance, while my survey sort of combined these two terms into one to allow for easier analysis of data. If future research differentiated between these, there could be further correlations found. Additionally, PSR frequency versus PSR strength could be measured. So my survey measured PSR strength and found no correlation. But if PSR frequency was measured, for example, that could include the rate at which new PSRs are formed, or perhaps the number of PSRs that someone has. There could be a correlation found between that and parental support. And also my study could be replicated outside of the Midwestern region, and perhaps different results could be found that way. So here are my references.
All right, in the 5 minutes we have left, I have a few questions for you. How did you determine which results generated by your research method were the most important for informing your new understanding?
So my research method generated 2 separate sets of data, group A's and group B's. And I decided to use group A's data in informing my new understanding because they had both variables that I was studying while group B didn't. So I used the data from group A to find my correlation coefficient. And using that, I determined that there was no correlation between the two variables and that my hypothesis was incorrect.
Okay, our second question?
How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
So my research focused on the intensity of a PSR, and future research could instead focus on the frequency of a PSR. So that could be the rate at which PSRs are formed or the number of PSRs someone has. So there could be a different correlation found between that and parental support using that method.
And our last question.
What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
So before this project, I hadn't really had reason to read full 30 or 40 page research papers in full. But when I was writing my literature review and conducting research for this project, I developed the skills to analyze data, conclusions, and the credibility of papers. And because of that, I can now use other people's research for my own papers. And I think this will be especially useful when I'm conducting research in college, especially since I intend to major in a STEM field. So, yeah.